There was a moment when I wasn't sure if prayer really worked. I had said the words, made the time, whispered in silence, but still felt nothing. Nothing changed around me, nothing shifted within me, or so I thought. What if 30 days could change the way you see God and yourself? You don't have to be a spiritual giant to start. You just have to begin, even when you don't feel like it. Especially when you don't. I didn't expect much when I committed to praying every day for 1 month. I didn't have a dramatic plan. I wasn't chasing a breakthrough or hoping for a miracle. I was simply tired of feeling stuck in my faith, tired of the spiritual numbness that had quietly crept in over time. So I decided to do the only thing left that still felt possible: talk to God every day for 30 days straight. The first few days felt awkward. My prayers were clumsy, unfocused, distracted. I wasn't sure if I was doing it right. I found myself repeating the same phrases or sitting in long silences that made me feel more distant from God than connected. But I stayed with it, even when it felt empty, especially when it felt empty. By day 5, something small shifted. Not in my circumstances, those stayed the same, but in my awareness. I noticed how often I reached for distractions instead of presence, how often I avoided silence, how much noise filled my mind. The act of praying daily became less about asking God to change things and more about letting Him change me. I began journaling during prayer. Not eloquent paragraphs, just short notes. Words of frustration, simple gratitude, a few questions I didn't know how to answer. That practice slowed me down. It grounded me. I started to notice how my heart reacted to certain thoughts, how my emotions rose and fell throughout the prayer. It wasn't always peaceful. Sometimes it brought tears, but the honesty felt like worship. Around day 10, I started sensing patterns. My mind was clearer in the morning when I prayed before touching my phone. I felt more emotionally resilient after talking to God about the things that were weighing on me. Even when nothing around me had changed, everything inside of me was slowly shifting. Anxiety didn't disappear, but it softened. Worries still came, but they didn't shout as loudly. There was space in my heart now, space that hadn't been there before. Praying every day wasn't a magical solution. I didn't suddenly become a different person, but I became more myself, more aware, more honest. I began noticing when I was performing in prayer and when I was actually speaking from the deepest part of me. I saw how often I tried to impress God with words instead of simply showing up with presence. By week 3, prayer felt like home. Not a duty, not a performance, not a habit I had to force. It became the place I could go when I didn't know where else to turn. It became a daily rhythm that softened my anger, quieted my fear, and slowly rewired my thoughts. I wasn't trying to control God with my prayers anymore. I was finally learning how to surrender. One surprising effect I hadn't expected was how prayer impacted the way I treated people. I was slower to judge, quicker to forgive, more open to listening. I started praying for people I had struggled to love. At first it was difficult. Sometimes I could only say, "God, please help me not to hate them." But even that was a beginning. Over time, my heart softened. I started seeing others through different eyes. Prayer made me kinder, not because I tried harder, but because grace flowed through the cracks in me I used to hide. Somewhere between day 20 and day 30, the question stopped being, "Is this working?" and became, "How did I live without this?" There were still dry days, days when I didn't want to pray, days when I only had a sentence or two to offer. But something had changed. I no longer believed that silence meant absence. I no longer measured God's love by how emotional I felt during prayer. I learned to rest in the quiet, trusting that He was there even when I couldn't feel Him. By the end of 30 days, I wasn't a new person, but I was a more grounded one. Prayer didn't remove every problem. It didn't eliminate all stress, but it gave me a place to carry it, a place to place it down. And that changed everything. What happens when you pray every day for 30 days? You begin to see yourself more clearly and love yourself more honestly. You begin to see God not as a distant judge, but as a present friend. You begin to live slower, listen deeper, surrender more. You stop trying to get something out of prayer and start giving yourself into it. And slowly, without even realizing it, your soul begins to breathe again. That's where the journey begins. There's something mysterious that happens when you show up consistently to the same quiet space each day. You begin to realize how much of your life is lived on autopilot. How many conversations with God are actually rehearsed monologues. How often you're speaking at Him instead of with Him. Around the second week, I realized that prayer had become more than an act. It had become a mirror. The moment I sat down, I came face to face with my own heart. Restless, overcommitted, anxious. I noticed how hurried my soul had become, how resistant I was to stillness. Even in prayer, I wanted productivity, I wanted results. But slowly, I began to surrender that expectation too. One morning, I asked God a simple question. What do you want to show me today? And then, I waited. Not for an audible voice, not for some dramatic sign. I just stayed in the silence and listened. That moment changed everything. Because in that stillness, I began to hear what I had drowned out for years, the quiet ache in my own soul. The longing to be known, not for what I do or say or achieve, but simply for who I am. That's what prayer began to do. It reintroduced me to the parts of myself I had buried beneath busyness, the unspoken fears, the unanswered questions, the dreams I was afraid to voice aloud, the parts of my heart I didn't think God wanted to see. But He did, and He met me there, again and again. Prayer was no longer just about spiritual discipline. It became a place of emotional honesty, a sacred conversation where I didn't have to filter my pain, where I could say, I'm angry, or I feel alone, or I don't know if I believe this today, and not fear rejection. And the more I said those things, the more I realized that God wasn't waiting for me to perform. He was waiting for me to be real. One of the most healing days came when I simply cried. I didn't have words. I couldn't articulate what was wrong. I just sat there, tears falling, heart open. And in that silence, I felt more seen than I ever had in loud, passionate prayers. It was like God whispered, "You don't need to explain, I'm here." As the days passed, I started bringing ordinary things into prayer. My commute, my grocery list, the tension in a friendship, my frustration over unfinished goals. Nothing was too small. That was new for me. I had always treated prayer like it had to be big, holy, urgent. But God began teaching me that He delights in the details, that the mundane is sacred too, that I didn't have to wait for a crisis to talk to Him. Something else shifted in those days. I started noticing the presence of God in places I hadn't before. In the way the sunlight hit the kitchen table, in the stillness of early mornings, in the laughter of a friend, in the warmth of a hot drink after a long day. Prayer had opened my eyes. I wasn't just meeting God in quiet moments anymore. I was seeing Him in everything. One night, after a long and stressful day, I sat in prayer and said nothing. I was too exhausted. But instead of guilt, I felt peace. It was as if God said, "You don't need to bring me energy, just bring me you." That moment freed me. Prayer wasn't something I had to do well anymore. It was simply the space I returned to, where God was always waiting. About 3 weeks in, I started praying for others more intentionally, not because I had a list or obligation, but because my heart had become softer. I began praying for my parents, my siblings, people I'd lost touch with, even people who had hurt me. And over time, those prayers did something profound. They rewired my heart. I no longer carried the same resentment or distance. I saw their humanity more clearly. I began to love without needing to control, forgive without needing an apology. That's the quiet power of daily prayer. It transforms you, not with a loud bang, but with a slow and steady rhythm that you only recognize in hindsight. There were hard days too. Days I forgot to pray. Days I rushed through it. Days I didn't want to talk to God at all. But instead of starting over, I just kept going. That was the lesson. Grace doesn't reset, it continues. I didn't need a perfect streak. I just needed to keep showing up. Prayer gave me a deep internal shift, a peace that wasn't based on answers, but on presence. A joy that wasn't about feeling good, but about being known. A strength that came not from pushing through, but from kneeling down. I used to think prayer was about changing God's mind. Now I know it's about changing mine, about aligning my heart with His, about learning to listen before I speak, about trusting the silence, about becoming still enough to notice when His Spirit is whispering, "This is the way, walk in it." And it all began with just one choice, to pray. Day by day, moment by moment, I was becoming someone new, not because I tried harder, but because I let go. Let go of needing to control. Let go of needing to have the perfect words. Let go of the old stories I told myself about who I had to be. Prayer didn't add more to my life. It peeled layers off. Until I remembered the simple truth I had forgotten. God was always with me. I had just stopped noticing. And now, I see him everywhere. Somewhere around the third week, the stillness became familiar. Not always comfortable, but familiar. I found myself craving it in moments of chaos. Like a steady place inside me I could return to, even when life outside felt overwhelming. I stopped seeing prayer as a pause from reality and began to see it as the anchor within it. One morning I woke up restless. My mind was already sprinting. Deadlines, appointments, worries stacked like a tower ready to fall. I sat down anyway, closed my eyes, breathed. I whispered, God, I don't have it together today. And immediately I felt this gentle sense that I didn't need to. He wasn't asking for a performance, just my presence. That day I didn't say much. I didn't know what to say, but prayer had taught me by then. Sometimes showing up is the prayer. Sometimes stillness is the song. By then something else had shifted too. I noticed how my reactions to people were changing. I had more patience, less irritation. It wasn't magic, it was practice. 30 days of prayer had trained something deeper in me, like a muscle that learns to pause before reacting. I could see a conversation spiraling toward frustration, and instead of matching the tone, I would just breathe. And then I'd pray silently, Lord, help me see them the way you do. There was a particular moment that stunned me. I was in the middle of an argument with someone I love. Words were flying fast and pain was rising. But mid-sentence, something inside me stilled. I heard the whisper, listen. And for once I did. I stopped defending. I started seeing. Prayer had given me a new reflex, not to win, but to love. During that third week, I also began to journal after prayer. Not long entries, just a few words, what I felt, what I noticed, what I sensed God saying. And the journal became a map. I could trace how my heart was healing, how fears that once screamed were now quiet, how wounds that once bled had begun to close, how slowly, gently I was being reshaped. Not all the prayers were deep. Some were just simple check-ins. God, I'm tired. God, help me be present today. God, thank you for that moment with my friend. And those small prayers felt like drops of water on dry ground, unremarkable but life-giving. They reminded me that prayer doesn't have to be profound. It just has to be honest. I had always thought prayer required energy, but over time I realized it gives energy. Not always physical, but spiritual, emotional. The kind of quiet resilience that carries you through a hard meeting, a long drive, a painful memory. The kind of strength that doesn't look impressive, but holds everything together inside. One night, I remembered a childhood fear I had buried for years. I had a dream about it, and it shook me awake. Instead of pushing it aside, I brought it into prayer. For the first time in years, I spoke it out loud. I expected shame, but instead I felt compassion. I felt God meet me not as a judge, but as a healer. And I wept, not because I was weak, but because I finally felt safe enough to be known. That's when I realized something crucial. Prayer doesn't just connect you to God. It connects you to yourself. It opens the doors you've locked. It turns on lights in rooms you've avoided. It doesn't expose you to embarrass you. It reveals you to restore you. By now, I had fallen into a rhythm. My body knew when it was time. My soul leaned into it, like a familiar embrace. Even the space I prayed in started to feel sacred, not because of the room, but because of what happened there. It became a sanctuary, a refuge, a place where masks dropped and truth returned. There was a day I felt nothing. No spark, no emotion, just quiet. I almost skipped prayer, telling myself it wouldn't matter. But I remembered something I'd heard. Relationships aren't built on fireworks, but faithfulness. So I showed up, sat down, said a simple prayer, I'm here. And though nothing dramatic happened, I felt peace settle in like morning light. That's the thing about 30 days of prayer. It teaches you that not every moment needs to be intense. Sometimes the silence is the blessing. The discipline is the miracle. The fact that you keep coming back, that's where the transformation happens. Around day 23, I began to intercede for people more deeply. Not just listing names, but asking God to truly meet them, to heal wounds I didn't even know they carried, to speak to their hearts the way He had spoken to mine. And as I prayed for others, my own heart softened again. Compassion grew where judgment had lived. Grace expanded where distance once stood. There was one night I prayed for someone I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who hurt me deeply. I didn't have words of blessing, only a flicker of willingness. And I whispered, God, I don't know how to forgive, but I want to. That was enough. I felt something shift, not resolved, but released. That's what this journey had become, a long releasing of pride, of control, of old stories, of self-protection. Prayer became the daily practice of laying down my armor and trusting that I was still held. And slowly, God was revealing himself not just in the answers, but in the waiting, in the quiet, in the days that felt ordinary and the ones that felt holy. He was there every time. I just needed to slow down enough to see him. By this point, prayer wasn't something I scheduled. It was something I returned to like breath. It had become part of me, not just a practice, but a posture, a way of being, a place to stand in a world constantly moving. The moments I laughed in prayer, moments I sang, moments I sat in silence with a candle flickering beside me. There were no rules anymore, just relationship, just realness. And in all of it, I began to believe something I had only hoped for before, that God actually delights in being with me, that he enjoys my presence as much as I long for his. 30 days of prayer didn't make me perfect. It didn't erase every fear or solve every problem, but it changed the way I see, the way I breathe, the way I live. It reoriented my soul. I stopped needing proof. I started trusting presence, and that made all the difference. On day 25, I caught myself whispering a prayer without even thinking. I was washing dishes, and the words just came out. God, thank you for today. No ceremony, no intention, just instinct. That's when I realized how deeply prayer had been woven into the fabric of my day. It was no longer an event, it had become a rhythm, a background song playing beneath everything else. Even my language had changed. I noticed more gratitude in the way I spoke, even to myself. Where I once said, I have to do this, I found myself saying, I get to. Where I once muttered complaints, I now murmured thanks. It wasn't forced, it was fruit of time spent in stillness, of moments spent with God. And the strangest part, people noticed. A friend asked me if something had changed. She said I seemed lighter. I wasn't trying to project anything, but somehow the peace I'd been soaking in began to leak out into the world around me. Prayer had quietly rewritten the way I carried myself, and in doing so, it gently influenced the way others experienced me. There was a moment in traffic, a place I used to lose my patience daily. Someone cut me off and I started to react. But then a soft reminder, pray. And instead of anger, I said, God, give them peace. Maybe they're rushing to something that hurts. That shift stunned me. Not because I had tried to be holy, but because prayer had softened the reflexes of my heart. I began praying during walks, not with words always. Sometimes just breathing in gratitude, breathing out worries. I started seeing beauty in unnoticed places, leaves dancing in the wind, the sound of birds arguing in the trees, the warmth of sunlight on my back. It wasn't just nature. It felt like God waving quietly through the everyday. I had passed those sights 100 times. Prayer gave me new eyes. Some mornings I opened my Bible after praying, not because I had to, but because I wanted to know this God who was so near. And the words didn't feel distant anymore. They felt alive, like they were written for this very moment in my life. A verse I had read years ago suddenly cut through me with gentleness and clarity. It said, "Be still and know that I am God." And I knew it wasn't a command, it was an invitation. I stopped expecting prayer to change my circumstances. I started realizing how much it was changing me. The way I spoke, the way I responded, the way I rested. I even slept better. Not because everything was peaceful around me, but because something was peaceful within me. One night, I had nothing to say. I just sat in the quiet, candle flickering beside me. I imagined God sitting across from me, saying nothing, just being there. It sounds strange, but I felt more seen in that silence than in any elaborate prayer I'd ever said. There's something holy about simply being together. I realized how many of my past prayers had been filled with effort, trying to sound right, trying to be right. But this new rhythm taught me that God doesn't respond to performance. He responds to presence. And presence doesn't need polish. It just needs honesty. By day 27, I started remembering things I had buried. Old regrets, unfinished prayers, people I had lost touch with, not just in life but in my heart. I brought those into prayer too, not all at once, just one by one. And each time there was no thunder, just warmth, just light, like a father welcoming a child who finally had the courage to speak. I remember praying, God, I don't even know how to feel about this memory. And it was like I heard him whisper, then just feel it with me. That moment unraveled something inside me. I had always thought I needed to fix things before bringing them to God. Now I knew he wants to be invited into the middle of the mess, not just the cleaned up version. I started feeling more grounded, even when nothing externally changed. That's the paradox of prayer. Your storm can keep raging, but somehow you're not as shaken. The wind still blows, but you're anchored, not because of you, but because of who holds you. And in those last few days of the month, I noticed how often I said thank you. Not as a routine, as a reflex. I'd find myself overwhelmed, and instead of spiraling, I'd whisper, thank you that I'm not alone. I'd feel tired, and I'd say, thank you that you are my rest. Gratitude wasn't something I had to generate. It was something that naturally surfaced after sitting with God day after day. I didn't feel more powerful. I felt more peaceful, more aligned, more real. I had stopped pretending in prayer, and that honesty seeped into the rest of my life. I was no longer performing for people. I was no longer exhausting myself trying to appear unshaken. I was being shaped day by day by the quiet presence of God. I began to understand why Jesus often went away to pray. It wasn't an escape. It was a return, a reconnection, a recalibration. And after 30 days, I knew I'd be going away to pray too. Not out of guilt, but out of desire. Because prayer had become not just a place to speak, but a place to be known. A place to belong. A place where I didn't have to explain myself before being embraced. On day 29, I walked to a familiar place in the park. I sat under a tree and prayed aloud, not loudly, just freely. For the first time, I didn't care who saw or heard me. That wasn't the point. I had learned that prayer wasn't a secret I needed to hide. It was a relationship I got to carry everywhere, and something about that tree, that breeze, that moment, it felt like home. That evening, as I sat on my bed with my prayer journal, I read through the entries. Day 1, uncertain, distracted, shallow. Day 8, a little more open. Day 16, deeper honesty. Day 23, trust. Now, almost 30 days later, I saw not just a change in my words, but in my heart. The arc of transformation wasn't dramatic, it was faithful. That's what I learned most. Transformation through prayer isn't about fireworks. It's about showing up again and again, letting God gently reshape what you thought was permanent. And sometimes the greatest miracle isn't a sudden answer. It's a softened heart, a still mind, a deep, quiet knowing that you are held, even when life doesn't make sense. On the 30th day, I woke up before my alarm. The sky outside was still dark, the house still quiet, but I wasn't rushing. I wasn't reaching for my phone. I sat up slowly, wrapped myself in a blanket, and simply said, "Good morning, God." And that small phrase, once mechanical and unsure, now felt like the beginning of a conversation with someone I deeply knew. There was no checklist that morning, no structured prayer plan. I just sat in the stillness, aware of God's presence like breath, unseen but sustaining. For the first time in my life, prayer didn't feel like a thing I do. It felt like a space I lived in, a space where I could come as I am and leave more myself than I arrived. Throughout that final day, I noticed how different I had become. Not louder in my faith, not more impressive in spiritual vocabulary, just more attuned. I noticed people's pain more quickly. I paused more. I reacted less. There was room inside me now, room for others, room for grace, room for peace. 30 days ago, I would have never guessed that something as quiet as prayer could clear that much space inside a soul. I thought back to the first few days, how clumsy they felt. I had doubted whether this would do anything. I expected either a dramatic breakthrough or dull routine, but instead I experienced slow healing. The kind you don't notice until you wake up one day and realize you're not carrying what used to weigh you down. The kind of change that happens not with fire, but with gentle, persistent light. I journaled that night and found my pen writing words I hadn't planned. Thank you for not leaving me in silence. Thank you for reshaping the silence. Because somewhere along the way, the silence that once felt empty had become sacred. And now, when life gets noisy again, I know where to return. I had not become perfect in prayer. I had become present in it. And that presence changed how I approached everything else. Tasks didn't feel as heavy. Conversations felt more intentional. Even pain had a place to go, into the hands of a God who now felt near, not distant. Not because I had mastered prayer, but because I had stopped pretending and simply showed up. I started looking at my day, not as blocks of time to survive, but as opportunities to return to that quiet space with God, whether in traffic, in line at the store, or walking from room to room. Prayer became portable. It traveled with me because it was no longer tied to location or mood. It was tied to relationship. On that last night, I sat outside, sky turning from blue to black, stars beginning to blink into sight, and I found myself praying for someone else, fully, genuinely, not as a task, but as a gift. Prayer was no longer self-focused. It had grown wider, deeper. I could carry others to God not out of duty, but because my heart had made room for them. 30 days of prayer had taught me to see beyond myself. That's when I realized this isn't the end of a 30-day experiment. This is the beginning of a new way to live. I don't know what the next month will hold, but I know I won't face it alone. And I know I don't have to wait for crisis to start praying. I've tasted what it's like to walk with God daily, not perfectly, but honestly. And it changed more than I ever expected. It changed the way I see myself. I stopped coming to prayer only when I had it all together or when I was at my worst. I started coming just as I was, on ordinary mornings, in tired afternoons, through busy moments and quiet nights. I found that God meets us most naturally when we stop trying to impress Him, when we come with open hands and honest hearts. It changed the way I see others. I started praying less for outcomes and more for compassion. I stopped treating people's problems like puzzles to solve. I started asking God to show me how to love them, to listen better, to be patient. Prayer gave me a quieter mouth and a softer heart, and it changed the way I see God. He's not far. He's not cold. He's not measuring how long I pray or how poetic I sound. He's a father who walks with his children, who listens even when our words stumble, who stays even when we wander. I no longer pray to get something from Him. I pray because I found something in Him. Peace, clarity, presence. If you asked me what the most surprising thing was, I'd say it's how normal it all felt. And that's the beauty. Prayer didn't take me out of real life. It helped me live it. Fully. Attentively. Anchored. I had no visions, no dramatic signs, but I had a growing awareness that I was known, that even in silence I wasn't alone, that even in doubt I was held. And now, on the other side of this 30-day journey, I can say, prayer doesn't always change your world, but it always changes your center. And once your center shifts, the world looks different too. So here I am, 30 days later, not with a formula, but with a testimony. God met me in the quiet, and He'll meet you too. Not because you pray perfectly, but because He loves to be near His children. And now I won't stop. Because once you've lived 30 days with daily prayer, you realize this isn't a challenge to complete. It's a way to live, a way to walk with God, a way to breathe again, a way home. And if this story stirred something in you, if it made you curious, if it whispered, maybe this is for me too, then I invite you, don't let this be the end. Let it be your beginning. Terry. I didn't expect to cry on day 31. There wasn't a sermon. There wasn't a song. There was only me, sitting in the same spot I had prayed every morning for a month. And as I whispered the same simple opening, Father, I'm here. My heart broke open, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. Because I realized I had been heard every single day, even when my words were weak, even when I didn't feel anything, even when my mind wandered. He had been there, listening, waiting, loving. There's something sacred about being seen in your most ordinary moments, about having nothing to offer but still being welcomed. That's what prayer gave me. Not a perfect spiritual scorecard, but a place to fall apart and find rest, to speak and be silent, to ask and simply sit. Prayer didn't fix all my problems. I still faced pressure, doubt, distraction, but the weight was different now. The anxiety didn't grip as tightly. The fear didn't speak as loudly. Why? Because every day I had placed my fears into bigger hands, and those hands didn't let go. I started looking forward to prayer the way you look forward to hearing from a friend. It stopped being something I had to force. It started becoming something I needed, not for performance, but for connection. Because God had become real to me, not as a distant being, but as a daily presence. Sometimes I would speak, sometimes I would cry, sometimes I just sat and breathed, and in all those moments, God was not impatient. He wasn't asking for eloquence, he was simply inviting me to stay. That changed me. The more I stayed, the less I felt the need to control. The more I stayed, the more aware I became of how deeply loved I was. Not for what I did, not for how long I prayed, just loved. Prayer softened parts of me I didn't know were hard. It revealed things I hadn't confessed. It comforted aches I didn't know still lingered. It gave me space to be fully human, confused, messy, sincere. It didn't matter whether I had prayed for 5 minutes or 30. What mattered was that I kept showing up, and God kept meeting me. In the stillness, in the struggle, in the silence, especially in the silence. I began to recognize God in places I never looked before. A child's laughter, a kind stranger sunrise, a quiet moment between errands. Prayer had rewired my awareness. Life was no longer divided between spiritual and normal. Everything became sacred, because God was in it all. Even conflicts began to change. I didn't snap as quickly. I asked God for patience before responding. I paused. I listened more. It didn't make me flawless, but it made me present. I was no longer reacting to life. I was walking through it with someone beside me. I still had doubts, still had days where my mind wandered, but now I didn't feel ashamed. I brought that into prayer too. And God, always gentle, reminded me, I'm still here. That steadiness began to anchor me. In a world that constantly shifts, God was the one constant, and prayer, once a foreign act, had become a rhythm that carried me. Even in my most unspiritual moments, I knew where to return. And that's the thing. This 30-day journey didn't end when the calendar flipped. It simply revealed what was always possible. That God is not far. That we can begin again every single morning. That prayer doesn't have to be polished. It just has to be real. I used to think prayer was mostly about asking for things. Now I know it's about presence, about remembering who I am, about letting God remind me who He is. Over time, my prayers changed from fix this to be with me, from take it away to teach me through it. I stopped trying to escape my weakness and instead began to bring it honestly before God. That changed everything. Even joy felt deeper. I noticed beauty in places I'd overlooked. I thanked God more often, not out of duty, but because I was genuinely moved. Gratitude had become my new default, and on the hard days, I didn't spiral as easily. Prayer had become a path I could always walk back to, a lighthouse, a hand on my shoulder, a voice whispering, "You're not alone." There's a confidence that builds when you consistently talk with God. Not pride, but peace. A peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. A peace rooted in relationship. And that peace began to affect how I saw everything. I stopped needing to prove myself to people. I stopped chasing every opinion, because I had learned to listen to one voice above all others. And that voice spoke love, truth, grace. Some days I prayed while washing dishes, some days while driving, others in tears, others in joy. But the through line was this: I kept showing up, and so did God. Even when I felt nothing, He was working. Even when I doubted, He stayed. And that consistency, His, not mine, is what transformed me. I wish I could tell you prayer made my life perfect. It didn't, but it made it deeper, richer, truer, and it made me more whole. Now looking back, I can say this: prayer didn't change who God was, it changed who I believed Him to be. And in that shift, I found something unshakable. God was never waiting for me to get it right. He was simply waiting for me to come close. If you've ever struggled with prayer, if it's felt dry, confusing, or forced, I want you to know you're not alone. And it's not too late to begin again. Start small, start awkward, just start. Because the God who meets you isn't waiting with a stopwatch. He's waiting with open arms. He's already listening. He's already near. And 30 days of prayer can open a lifetime of closeness with Him. So wherever you are right now, whether strong in faith or barely holding on, I invite you, take a step. Whisper a prayer. Let silence become a meeting place. Let your soul speak honestly, and keep going. Because something holy happens when you keep coming back. You begin to trust. You begin to heal. You begin to live differently. And through it all, God doesn't grow tired. he just grows closer. If this journey resonated with you, if it stirred a longing to reconnect or to begin for the first time, then come walk with us. At Think Fresh Daily, we share real stories of faith, healing, and hope. Not to impress, but to remind you, you are not alone. Follow Think Fresh Daily for more, because prayer is just the beginning, and your story is still unfolding.